You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Election's Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now, ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's March 1905, outside the home of Mrs. Henry Parrish, Jr. at 8 East 76th Street in Manhattan. The Parrishes have offered their home for a very special wedding. Both the bride and groom come from powerful New York families. Technically, one powerful family. The bride is the groom's fifth cousin. Inside the Parrish home, the guests, mostly relatives and intimate friends, are gathered in the drawing room, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Outside, the streets are packed with adoring fans, but they aren't here for the young couple. The fans are here to lay eyes on the bride's uncle, the most famous man in America. Many in the crowd have been waiting all day. Among them are two young men, both beyond excited. When's he going to be here? Any moment. They say he's standing in for the bride's father. His brother died, When did he die? About 10 years ago. What happened? Well, now that's a story. So the bride's father had a drinking problem, they say. He was confined to a sanitarium, and then he jumped out of a window. Good God. Yeah, tragedy, really. But what a man her uncle is. To come all the way from Washington to walk his niece down the aisle? What a man indeed. Just then, a small car appears down the street. As it comes to a stop in front of the Parrish home, Secret Service agents in dark suits quickly hop out and open the door, revealing the famous man everyone has been waiting to see. He looks dapper, sporting a dashing suit with a black top hat. As the man steps out of the car, the crowd shows their appreciation, and the two eager men try to get closer. Come on. Where? Where are you going? I want to see if I can shake his hand. Desperate to meet him, the two men barreled through the crowd, as agents in dark suits do their best to escort the fellow to the front door. He bounds up the stairs, shaking hands and loving every minute of the attention. When he reaches the top, he turns around, flashes a grin, and gives a big wave.
It's a beautiful day for a wedding, isn't it?
And with that, he turns and disappears inside the Parrish's home. The two young men are disappointed. Did you shake his hand? No. Walked right past me. Same here. Should we go or should we stay? Well, he's got to come out eventually. Let's wait for him.
We want Teddy.
Just then, a lone voice starts a chant.
We want Teddy.
The two men join in the chant, along with the rest of the crowd.
We want Teddy. We want Teddy.
President Teddy Roosevelt's daughter Alice once observed, "My father wanted to be the corpse at every funeral, the bride at every wedding, and the baby at every christening." And at this particular wedding, the wedding of Franklin Delano and Eleanor Roosevelt, Teddy stole the show. Standing in for his late brother, he walked his niece Eleanor down the aisle and gave her away. The ceremony was underscored by the sound of the crowd chanting his name outside. When the Reverend finished the ceremony, Teddy called out from the congregation, "Well, Franklin, there's nothing like keeping the name in the family." Teddy then kissed the bride and led the guests into the next room for refreshments. Franklin and Eleanor tried to form a reception line, but the crowd followed Teddy, and within a few minutes the newlyweds were standing alone. It wouldn't be the last time Franklin Roosevelt would play second fiddle to his famous cousin. As a political up-and-comer, FDR would spend the next 40 years trying to escape Teddy's shadow and build a name for himself. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Election's Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, The Battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the Revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. The Roosevelt family were immigrants to New Amsterdam, a 17th century Dutch settlement on the southern tip of Manhattan. The Oyster Bay Roosevelts, Teddy and Eleanor's line, settled in Long Island. The Hyde Park Roosevelts, Franklin's line, settled in Dutch County. Teddy made a huge impact on Franklin. As a young man, Franklin watched his cousin's meteoric rise with great interest. As a student, after Franklin heard Teddy speak, he vowed to become active in politics. And like his cousin, Franklin attended Harvard undergrad before studying law at Columbia. Also like Teddy, Franklin left law school early to get into politics. Both men served in the New York legislature by the time they were 30. Both were appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by the time they were 40, and both went on to serve as popular governors of New York. The two Roosevelts were both progressives, but whereas Teddy gravitated toward the Republican Party, Franklin made his home with the Democrats. Franklin worshipped his cousin and did his best to follow in his footsteps, but Teddy's were big shoes to fill. Teddy was a gifted athlete, a renowned historian, and a war hero. Crippled by a polio diagnosis, Franklin spent the majority of his adult life in a wheelchair and never served in the military. Teddy won the vice presidency under President McKinley before taking the White House. Franklin lost his vice presidential bid in the election of 1920. But Franklin was determined to make his own mark. After serving 2 terms in the White House as America's 32nd president, FDR made history by becoming the first and only president to win a 3rd term in office. In the 1944 presidential election, with the country at war with the Axis powers, FDR would try to make history again. This is episode 40, 1944, Dewey versus Roosevelt, The Last Stand. It's early afternoon, December 7th, 1941. President Franklin D. Roosevelt has just finished lunch. He sits in his Oval study on the 2nd floor of the White House with his aide Harry Hopkins. The work of a president never stops, but it's a quiet Sunday afternoon, and that's a good thing, because it gives FDR a chance to work on his favorite hobby, his massive stamp collection. But FDR's leisurely afternoon is interrupted by the phone. Yes? Mr. President, I'm sorry to bother you on a Sunday, but I have a caller for you on the line. Who is it? Secretary Knox. Put him through. Yes, sir, right away. When Navy Secretary Frank Knox comes on the line, there's panic in his voice. Mr. President. What can I do for you, Frank? Sir, it looks as if the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. FDR doesn't flinch, and he doesn't panic. As he wraps up his conversation with Secretary Knox, he remains deadly calm. FDR hangs up the phone and calmly relays the information of the attack to his nearby aide, Harry Hopkins. Hopkins is incredulous. I just don't believe it, Mr. President. I certainly do. It's just the kind of unexpected thing the Japanese would do. At the very time they were discussing peace in the Pacific, they were plotting to overthrow it. Within moments, the Oval study is flooded with cabinet officers. There's a flurry of phone calls as aides and White House secretaries stream in and out with top-secret cables in hand. The information that rolls in throughout the day is devastating. In 2 waves of attack, the Japanese Air Force sank 5 battleships, 3 more severely damaged. over 2,400 Americans are dead, the most ever killed in a single attack to date. By the early evening, a crowd of concerned citizens gather outside the White House's iron fence. They solemnly sing a familiar tune. Just after 9 p.m., FDR sits alone in the Blue Room when there's a knock on the door. "Mr. President, you wanted to see me?" "Sit down, Grace." Grace Tully is FDR's private secretary, one of his most trusted staff members. "What can I do for you, sir?" "I'm going to go before Congress tomorrow, and I'd like to dictate my message to you." "Of course. Should we begin now?" "Now, please. It will be short." As Grace readies herself at the typewriter, FDR begins. "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in world history." FDR's speech was brief, but it was lasting. It was arguably the most famous political speech of the 20th century. Grace Tully typed up Roosevelt's dictation, and the president immediately went to work making revisions. He crossed out "a date which will live in world history" and replaced it with words that now comprise one of the most famous phrases in all of American politics. The day after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, in a joint session of the U.S. Congress, FDR addressed the nation.
Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
In his speech, FDR emphasized that the attacks were premeditated and were a repudiation of Japan's prior overtures to peace.
It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace.
FDR laid out the case for taking action.
The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
For the first time since the end of World War I, America was again at war. The nation, roused by the attack on Pearl Harbor, largely rallied behind President Roosevelt. But World War II would be long and costly, and for many Americans, the price in blood would be far too steep. Fear and anxiety over FDR's expanded wartime powers was widespread. After FDR asked Congress to reduce the draft age to 18, voters registered their displeasure at the ballot box. In the 1942 midterm elections, Democrats suffered significant losses, while Republicans gained 10 seats in the Senate and 47 seats in the House. During his third term, FDR shifted his focus to the war, often at the expense of his progressive agenda. So in the run-up to the 1944 presidential contest, this shift left Republicans with an opening. The question was, who was best suited to unseat FDR? While not all Republicans agreed on the answer, most agreed on who was not the preferred candidate: Wendell Willkie. Business tycoon and political outsider Wendell Willkie had won the Republican nomination as a dark horse candidate in 1940. And in the general election that year, FDR had trounced him. Many Republicans were worried about history repeating itself 4 years later in 1944. Indeed, Willkie supporters had been hard at work drumming up support for Willkie since early 1943. As one party leader put it, Willkie's managers were putting undue pressure upon party leaders in every section of the country to pledge themselves to his cause before anyone else had a chance to be heard. To many conservatives, Willkie, a liberal Republican and former Democrat, was an existential threat to Republican ideals. And when Willkie kicked off his campaign in February of 1943, he had doubled down on his liberalism, telling a crowd of Republican women in Indiana, "There must never again be any question of the right of workers to bargain collectively, or of the fundamental right of all our citizens to be free of racial discriminations." Willkie asked the crowd, "Why should we be on the defensive always against a party that is a combination of northern political machines of the worst type and southern oligarchies that don't even allow Negroes to vote?" To many mainstream Republicans, these were dangerous questions, and Willkie had to be stopped. Fearful of another Willkie nomination, conservative Republicans launched a smear campaign during the primaries, circulating rumors that Willkie was working in cahoots with FDR to guarantee him a fourth term. Another rumor claimed Willkie was a drunk who abused his wife. To overcome these accusations, Willkie launched an aggressive primary campaign in the spring of 1944, traveling to 12 states in the West and getting in FaceTime with delegates. The tour was well received. Life magazine wrote, "Although political polls showed that Willkie still had a long uphill fight to win the nomination, his Western trip apparently put him back in the running." Willkie was hoping that instead of playing to the middle and wooing conservatives, he could garner enough support from progressives. But for Wendell Willkie, the real test of the viability of this strategy would be the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin did not have any party requirements, which meant that all voters, Republicans and Democrats, could vote for whomever they liked in the primary. Willkie hoped that enough progressive Democrats would cross party lines to put him in the top spot. So on March 18th, Willkie launched a 2-week tour of Wisconsin. On the trail, he spoke passionately about his liberal values and defended himself against the brazen attacks from his fellow Republicans. While speaking to a crowd at Lawrence College in Appleton, Willkie said, "Here in Wisconsin, I have no doubt that you have heard many things about me, including a story that I beat my wife. You also undoubtedly have heard that I have some kind of a deal with the administration to keep Mr. Roosevelt in office. My main objective in life is to make the Republican Party worthy of removing Mr. Roosevelt from office." He also wrote off the accusation that he was a drunk, saying, "I'll take a glass of beer if that's any news to you. I had one the other day." But in the 1944 primary, the central issue for most voters was not Willkie's relationship with alcohol. It was World War II. On his tour of Wisconsin, Willkie attacked the isolationist stance of conservative Republicans. According to Willkie, these were the same men who had opposed him in 1940 because they were against every form of international cooperation to maintain peace throughout the world. Today, in this campaign in Wisconsin for delegates, I am expecting opposition from the same forces. Willkie's principled wartime stand against the Republican establishment earned him the endorsement of the Capital Times in Madison. And Willkie made countless speeches and covered hundreds of miles, speaking himself hoarse to tens of thousands of Wisconsinites. But as Willkie's campaign picked up steam, so too did the attacks against him. But Willkie embraced his outsider status, telling a large crowd in La Crosse that they should love him for the enemies he has made. Willkie claimed to have the most valuable list of enemies of any public figure in America. And his biggest enemy was Republican frontrunner Thomas Dewey. Dewey, a former prosecutor who took on organized crime in New York, was no stranger to frontrunner status. Going into the 1940 Republican convention, Dewey had been the clear favorite, but the dark horse Willkie had spoiled Dewey's chances and stolen the Republican nomination from him. So in 1944, Dewey was hoping for revenge. As Willkie wrapped up his Wisconsin tour, the New York Times wrote, Win, lose, or draw, Wilkie will have made a campaign that reflects the sincerity of his convictions and the high quality of his leadership. But with Wilkie gone from the state, the Dewey campaign launched an all-out press blitz, using signs, billboards, campaign pamphlets, and countless radio ads to attack Wilkie for his lack of leadership. Dewey had been happy to let Wilkie spend 2 weeks dominating the Wisconsin primary. His strategy, according to American author Alan Drury, was to let Wilkie talk himself to death in a vacuum. And after the Wisconsin votes were counted on April 4th, Dewey won 17 of the state's 24 delegates. Of the remaining 7, Wilkie didn't win a single one. The next day, at a speech in Omaha, Nebraska, Wilkie accepted his fate, telling the crowd, "It is obvious now that I cannot be nominated. I am therefore asking my friends not to present my name at the convention. I earnestly hope that the Republican convention will nominate a candidate and write a platform which really represents the views which I have advocated." And Wilkie would get his wish, at least in part. In the 1940 Republican primary, Thomas Dewey had not taken a strong stance on the European war for fear of angering conservative isolationist Republicans. His reluctance to do so had in part led to Wilkie's dark horse nomination in 1940. So leading up to the 1944 convention, Dewey would not make the same mistake again. The young governor would be far more vocal with his brand of internationalism, and his position on the war would help him secure the Republican nomination. But Dewey's age and inexperience was still a concern to many across the country, including in Washington. After Dewey's nomination, FDR's Interior Secretary joked that Dewey had thrown his diaper into the ring. So to balance the ticket with age and conservatism, Ohio Governor John Bricker was selected to be Dewey's running mate. Their campaign slogan caught on: "Win the war quicker with Dewey and Bricker." As Republicans prepared to sell the American people on the Dewey-Bricker ticket, FDR was struggling to unite the Democratic Party. It was not an unprecedented fourth term that gave most Democrats pause. It was FDR's scandal-prone vice president, the liberal Republican turned Democrat Henry A. Wallace. FDR and Wallace were close friends. In the 1940 contest, Wallace's controversial liberal past had caused many Democrats to turn on him and demand that FDR choose a different running mate. At the time, FDR had refused to cut ties. But in the 1944 contest, Wallace's past would again become an issue, and this time, with his nomination on the line, FDR would be forced to show his good friend the back door. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. By the summer of 1944, FDR was constantly battling illness, and he was losing the fight. FDR's personal secretary, Grace Tully, wrote, "I observed the signs of cumulative weariness, the dark circles that never quite faded from under his eyes, the more pronounced shake in his hand as he lit his cigarette, the easy slump that developed in his shoulders." The White House did their best to hide FDR's worsening condition, but many Democratic leaders could see the writing on the wall. In the face of FDR's declining health, it might have been a good idea for Democratic leaders to opt to go in a different direction, but their campaign slogan showed where they stood. Don't change horses in the middle of the stream. FDR was a wartime president, and the country was at war. The Democrats would stand behind him. Still, FDR's health did lift up the importance of choosing a suitable vice president. And for most Democrats, Henry Wallace was no longer the man for the job. If Wendell Willkie was too liberal for most Republicans, for most Democrats, Vice President Henry Wallace was on another planet. Wallace was stridently anti-racist and pro-civil rights at a time when those views were far from the mainstream. But his extreme progressivism wasn't the only strike against him. There was also the Dear Guru scandal. Decades before the 1944 campaign, Henry Wallace had developed an interest in an eccentric Russian named Nicholas Roerich, a mystic whose teachings were not at all Christian. Wallace had admired Roerich so much that he traded letters with him, wherein he seemed to discuss U.S. foreign policy. Roerich's loyalty to the U.S. was questionable at best, as was the severity of his influence over Wallace. During the 1940 presidential campaign, these previously undisclosed letters had fallen into Republican hands, and if released, the letters would have damaged Wallace's credibility and FDR's judgment. But the letters were never released, mainly because the Democrats had dirt on Republican candidate Wendell Willkie, and they threatened to expose Willkie's illicit affair with a powerful magazine editor named Arita Van Doren. But in Washington's inner circles, the Guru letters were common knowledge, and with Willkie out of the race and any chance of reciprocal extortion gone, there was always a chance Wallace's letters might be released. In 1940, FDR had refused to cut ties with Wallace. He was a close friend and a progressive ally. But by the summer of 1944, nearly the entire Democratic establishment had turned on Wallace, including several members of Roosevelt's inner circle and Bob Hannigan, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. These party leaders made it clear that if FDR stuck with Wallace, he might not win a fourth term. In the summer of 1944, FDR began to accept the inevitable. Wallace would have to go. It's July 10th, 1944 at the White House. Vice President Henry Wallace has just come from a meeting in the executive offices. As he makes his way through the lobby, Wallace is hounded by some 40 reporters.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Wallace, what did you and the President discuss in your meeting?
Well, we had a very lengthy conference about China. We discussed nothing else. The situation is very grave.
Mr. Vice President, are we to take it that the 1944 political situation was not even mentioned?
No, it was not mentioned.
Mr. Wallace, are you a candidate for nomination again for Vice President?
Recently, FDR's advisors privately told Wallace that he was a political liability and suggested he would cost the president votes. They asked him to resign. But today, when Wallace confronted the president about this, FDR was cagey. So now Wallace is frustrated, but he doesn't want to make a public spectacle. He flashes a smile and gives a measured answer.
We'll have to talk about the nomination at some future time. Are you going to the convention in Chicago next week?
I'm the chairman of the Iowa delegation. Of course I'm going.
Are you their favorite son?
Wallace pauses for a moment and considers his response to this very loaded question. If he says no, he'll be publicly conceding the contest for the vice presidency. If he says yes, he'll be throwing down the gauntlet by defying Democratic Party leaders. As he hesitates, the reporter presses the question.
What do you say, Mr. Vice President? Are you Iowa's favorite son, or aren't you?
I am. Wallace's conversation with reporters in the White House lobby was printed in the New York Times. To many, Wallace's intentions were crystal clear. As the Times explained, Wallace's responses were taken to mean that the vice president intended to go to Chicago next week as an avowed candidate for the renomination. For FDR, this was bad news, because Wallace wasn't going anywhere. While Henry Wallace was making waves in the press, Democratic leaders grappled with the question of his replacement. Going into the 1944 convention, the Democratic Party was deeply divided. In the North, labor leaders were at war with pro-business party bosses. In the South, many were fed up with government intervention, especially on issues of voting rights for Black Americans. Roosevelt had held the loose Democratic coalition together for 12 years, but FDR's popularity was waning. The vice presidential candidate might make or break party unity and sway the outcome of the election. So for FDR, the choice was a monumental one. As one DNC official would later write, the decision to shelve Vice President Wallace and nominate Senator Harry Truman in his place is one of the episodes in American history that will baffle scholars of the future, because no two accounts of it agree completely, and some vary widely. Harry Truman had made a big impression, leading one party leader to call Truman a cinch for the vice presidency. but Truman didn't want the job. In June, he had written a prominent Democratic business leader, "Please don't run me for vice president. I like my job as a United States senator, and that is where I want to stay." But party leaders wouldn't take no for an answer. On July 11, 1944, Roosevelt and his advisors gathered at the White House to pick a candidate. As the names of potential VPs were bandied about, FDR was unusually quiet. After listening for some time to the long list of candidates, FDR finally broke his silence and said, "All right, Bob, start talking." Bob Hannigan, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, was a longtime friend of Harry Truman. Hannigan, like Truman, hailed from Missouri, and Truman owed Hannigan as he helped elect Truman to the U.S. Senate. A Truman presidency was easy for Bob Hannigan to imagine. Truman lived in Missouri, a border state to the southern region, which would calm the fears of many Southern voters who were souring on FDR. Truman also had name recognition. His leadership in the Senate's Truman Committee had saved the government billions of dollars and made him extremely popular. Hannigan made his case, and afterwards FDR said, "Bob, I think you and everyone else here want Truman." It wasn't exactly a resounding endorsement, but for Hannigan it was more than enough. When Hannigan gave Henry Wallace the bad news, it didn't sit well. Offended, Wallace went straight to the president's office and offered his resignation. In response, FDR put on quite the show, saying, "I could not think of accepting." FDR tried to console Wallace, saying, "While I cannot put it just that way in public, I hope it will be the same old team." FDR acknowledged that another Wallace-Roosevelt ticket was an unlikely scenario, but not to worry, he told Wallace. He would find a job for him regardless. Wallace wasn't fooled by FDR's doublespeak. He would later write in his diary that FDR wanted to ditch me as noiselessly as possible. But Wallace was fully prepared to make some noise and put up a fight going into the Democratic convention. But he wasn't the only one. James F. Burns, FDR's director of the War Mobilization Office, did not want Wallace to be vice president either. Burns wanted the number 2 job for himself. On July 12th, James Burns telephoned FDR and asked him point blank, "I would like to know your opinion about my being a candidate." FDR's response was unequivocal. "You are the best qualified man in the whole outfit, and you must not get out of the race. If you stay in, you are sure to win." The next day, on July 13th, Burns and FDR sat down again, face to face at the White House, to continue the conversation. But then FDR explained that he felt conflicted. Wallace could not win, but he would likely not resign, which put FDR in a difficult position. Burns suggested that, in the interest of party unity, FDR should not publicly name a preference for vice president. FDR agreed and promised Burns he would not name one. Burns also tried to put FDR's mind at ease about an issue of growing importance in the 1944 contest, the black vote. Burns was a South Carolina man, and FDR had not been shy about his belief that a white Southern VP might cost him the black vote and perhaps the election. Burns assured the president that his Southern roots would not be a problem. FDR had done right by Black America, Burns explained. They would still vote for FDR, even with a South Carolinian like himself on the ticket. Burns left his meeting with the president supremely confident. But there was one looming threat that gave Burns pause: Harry Truman. Truman had the full-throated support of DNC Chairman Bob Hannigan, not to mention his powerful allies inside the Roosevelt administration. If Truman changed his mind about wanting the vice presidency, he had the political muscle to edge Burns out. So with the Democratic convention just around the corner, Burns did his best to use political means to eliminate the threat. On Friday morning, July 14th, the day after meeting FDR at the White House, Burns called Truman at his home in Independence, Missouri. Truman wrote that Burns told me that President Roosevelt had decided on him as the new nominee for vice president, and he asked me if I would nominate him at the convention. If Truman suspected that Burns was trying to neutralize his candidacy, he didn't put up a fight. According to Truman, I told him I would be glad to do it if the president wanted him for a running mate. And by all accounts, Truman was not playing a game. He meant what he said. Later that day, Burns met for lunch with Hannigan to tell him the good news that he had FDR's support for VP. Burns was befuddled when Chairman Hannigan told him that FDR preferred Harry Truman. When Burns explained his previous conversation with FDR, Hannigan was equally befuddled. Burns promptly called the president, told him what Hannigan had said, and asked him to clarify. FDR responded, "That is not what I told them. It is what they told me. They all agreed Truman would cost fewer votes. I had nothing to do with it." FDR went on to say, "After all, Jimmy, you were close to me personally. I hardly know Truman. If FDR was playing political tricks, James Burns couldn't figure out what they were. Burns called Hannigan and read him a transcript of his conversation with FDR. Hannigan was even more befuddled than before. The chairman responded, "I don't understand it." It's hard to say exactly why FDR was being evasive. Perhaps he didn't want to offend his friends. Perhaps he was genuinely trying to stay out of it. Perhaps illness was taking its toll on his mind. It's impossible to know. The DNC's PR director would later write that party leaders had tried to get a straight answer out of FDR, but the old man just wasn't going to play it that way. He had his own reasons, whatever they were, for being cagey, and he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction they were after. What's clear is that FDR was muddying the waters. Outwardly, he was pretending he did not have a preference, but in truth, he had already made up his mind. Days before, at his meeting with FDR on July 11th, Bob Hannigan had secured a written commitment from the president. Truman would later write that FDR's note was a piece of scratch paper about 2 inches by 8 and had only one name mentioned in it, and that was mine. FDR had decided, but Truman still didn't want the vice presidency, and he had already promised to nominate James Burns at the Democratic Convention. In the midst of the muddled affair, FDR would send Bob Hannigan to Chicago to convince Truman to go back on his word. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. It's late July 1944 on a Tuesday afternoon in Chicago. The Democratic Convention in Chicago Stadium is in full swing, but in a quiet room at Stevens Hotel, Senator Harry Truman is all alone. Exhausted from the convention, he lays down on the bed and puts up his feet. Just as he starts to drift off, there's a knock at the door.
How do you do, Harry?
How do you do, Bob?
May I come in?
Of course, sure. As Bob Hannigan makes his way into Truman's hotel room, he doesn't beat around the bush. Look, Harry, Roosevelt wants you for a running mate. Truman is annoyed. He's already made his feelings known to everyone, including the president, and Truman is not the sort of man who likes to repeat himself. Tell him to go to hell, Bob. I'm for Jimmy Burns. But Truman's old friend Bob Hannigan is a relentless man. Bob gives Truman the hard sell on the vice presidency and the duty of a public servant. But Truman is as stubborn as Bob is unrelenting. Bob, look here. I don't want to be vice president. I bet I can go down on the street and stop the first 10 men I see, and that they can't tell me the names of 2 of the last 10 vice presidents. I bet you can't even tell me who was McKinley's vice president. Bob stares at him blankly. You see, he had 2. The second one became the president, and you still can't remember. Harry, I want you to do me a favor. Go away, Bob. No. Now listen to me. On Thursday afternoon, come to my hotel room. There'll be some men there I'd like you to talk to. All right. 2 days later, Truman knocks on the door of Bob's room at the Blackstone Hotel. As Truman steps inside, he sees a bevy of Democratic Party bosses, men from Chicago, New York, and New Jersey. Immediately, the men start pressing Truman on the VP job. Truman sits on the bed, makes himself comfortable, as one by one the bosses take a crack at swaying him. But Truman's mind is made up. The room quiets as Bob picks up the phone. Hello?
Bob?
Mr. President.
Yes. Has Truman agreed?
No, sir, he hasn't agreed yet. Furious, the president's voice booms through the telephone.
Well, you tell him if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war, that's his responsibility.
Truman sighs. He heard the president loud and clear. So did everyone else in the room. Hannigan turns to Truman with a devilish grin. Harry, now what do you say? My God. The president's comment about the war caused Truman to reverse course. Truman told one of the party bosses that he had been a soldier and that a soldier's duty was to follow orders. Truman had enlisted in the Missouri National Guard and had gone on to fight in World War I. He saw firsthand the horrors of combat, and he learned what it meant to come together and fight for a good cause. FDR's comment reminded Truman that in the middle of a war, personal desires were of little importance. Truman acquiesced to FDR's wishes. At the Democratic Convention in July of 1944, the delegates nominated and rallied behind the Roosevelt-Truman ticket. But as FDR prepared to formally accept his party's nomination, personal tragedy would strike. On July 20th, 1944, FDR was set to make a formal acceptance speech over the radio. It was a massive press event. National radio networks, reporters, and photographers had all been invited to attend. But on the morning of July 20th, FDR's health took a turn for the worse. Throughout the 1944 campaign, rumors of the president's declining health had been rampant. But FDR's staff had done its best to keep his worsening condition under wraps. The morning of the 20th, FDR was racked with stomach pain, so much so that he asked his son James to help him onto the floor so that he might stretch out. James wrote that for 10 minutes, Father lay on the floor of the railroad car, his eyes closed, his face drawn, his powerful torso convulsed as the waves of pain stabbed him. FDR's aides were fully prepared to cancel the speech and send the press home, but FDR was determined not to show weakness. On the campaign trail, FDR's opponent, Governor Thomas Dewey, had tried to make the president's age and frailty a campaign issue. Dewey cast himself as the young, fresh-faced up-and-comer, saying it was time to get rid of the tired old men of the Roosevelt administration. So on July 20th, FDR fought through the stabbing pain and summoned the strength to put young Dewey in his place.
The people of the United States will decide this fall whether they wish to turn over this 1944 job, this worldwide job, to inexperienced or immature hands.
After taking a shot at Dewey's youth and inexperience, FDR reminded the listener that Dewey had not taken a strong stance on aiding the Allies back in 1940.
To those who opposed Lend-Lease and international cooperation against the forces of aggression and tyranny until they could read the polls of popular sentiment, or whether they wished to leave it to those who saw the danger from abroad, who met it head-on, and who now have seized the offensive and carried the war to its present stages of success.
Lastly, FDR took on the Republican Party as a whole.
They will also decide, these people of ours, whether they will entrust the task of post-war reconversion to those who offered the veterans of the last war bread lines and apple selling, and who finally led the American people down to the abyss of 1932, or whether they will leave it to those who rescued American business and agriculture and industry and finance and labor in 1933.
In his acceptance speech, FDR had drawn clear battle lines. He cast the wartime election as a contest between age and experience versus youth and folly. And the 1944 campaign seemed to invigorate the ailing president. While Dewey took a tour of the American West Coast, the president remained in Washington, focusing on the job of winning the war. Dewey's attacks on the campaign trail ranged from the predictable to the bizarre. Dewey called FDR corrupt and incompetent. In outlandish fashion, Dewey claimed that FDR had sent a U.S. Navy vessel to rescue his dog, Fala. Dewey claimed the dog had been left behind on an Alaskan island during a Japanese invasion. Dewey's youth was perhaps showing. On September 23, 1944, at the Statler Hotel in Washington, FDR responded.
These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me, or on my wife, or on my sons. No, not content with that. They now include my little dog, Fala. Well, of course, I
don't resent attacks, and my family don't resent attacks, but Fowler does resent it. You know, Fowler's Scotch. And being a Scotty, as soon as he learned that the Republican fiction writers in Congress and out had concocted a story that I'd left him behind on an Aleutian island and had sent a destroyer back to find him at a cost to the taxpayers of $2 or $3 or $8 or $20 million, his Scotch soul was furious. He has not been the same dog since.
In the late fall, as Dewey continued to attack him on the trail, FDR launched a vigorous campaign tour of his own. If anyone had doubts as to FDR's health, he put them to rest in October, when he rode for 5 hours in an open car in the middle of a torrential downpour in New York. But in the fall of 1944, most Americans were not focused on the fight for the presidency. In October, Life magazine published an article saying the most striking thing about the 1944 election was the seeming apathy of the voters. American voters were focused on the war overseas. And ultimately, the 1944 election was a referendum on FDR's wartime leadership. By November of 1944, the Allied forces were making significant progress against the Axis powers. The Soviet army was pushing into Eastern Europe, and their Western allies had finally pierced the veil of Germany. On Election Day 1944, the American people chose age and experience, giving FDR a fourth term and a mandate to bring the war to an end and establish a new global peace. Roosevelt won the election with over 25 million popular votes and 432 electoral votes to Dewey's 99. FDR's vigorous campaign in 1944 certainly impressed voters, and it helped to quiet rumors that his health was an issue. But the campaign had also taken its toll. After winning the 1944 election, the president's condition continued to worsen. FDR would never see the war's end. In April of 1945, just months before the end of World War II, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage. The job of winning the war and establishing peace would fall to his reluctant vice president, Harry Truman. As America's 33rd president, Truman would soon learn that FDR's declining health was not the only secret the president was keeping. Back in October of 1941, Roosevelt had approved the creation of a top-secret atomic bomb, an unprecedented weapon of war. Truman did not want the vice presidency, and he had not asked for the responsibilities that came with the highest office in the United States. But in August of 1945, with no end in sight to the bloody war in the Pacific, Truman would be faced with a fateful decision that would change the world and American politics forever. This is episode 40 of American Election's Wicked Game, 1944, The Last Stand. On the next episode, the election of 1948. In the wake of World War II, as President Truman fights to establish a new peace, Republican Governor Thomas Dewey gears up for a second run at the White House. As Truman strives to fulfill Franklin Roosevelt's progressive legacy, Dewey tries to capitalize on a growing anti-Truman sentiment brewing across the nation. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Election's Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Stephen Walters. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and CL Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.